He thought humiliating her would make him unforgettable, but Professor Richard Hale had no idea he was about to become the lesson no one would ever forget. The lecture hall at Westbridge University buzzed with quiet anticipation, rows of graduate students sitting beneath cold fluorescent lights, their notebooks open, their eyes fixed on the man at the front, a legend in advanced calculus, feared as much as he was admired. Hale adjusted his tailored blazer, his voice smooth and sharp as a blade as he filled the board with symbols most in the room barely understood, equations stretching across 6 feet of whiteboard like a language reserved for the elite. Then his eyes drifted, narrowing slightly as they landed on her. Emily Carter, standing near the back wall, dressed in a plain gray uniform, a cleaning cart beside her, her presence barely acknowledged by anyone else in the room. To them, she was invisible. To him, she was an irritation. He paused mid-lecture, tapping the marker against the board as a slow, knowing smile crept across his face. "You there," he called out, his voice echoing through the hall, slicing the silence. Conversations died instantly. Dozens of heads turned. Emily froze, her hand still resting on the handle of her cart. "Yes, you," Hale continued, gesturing toward the board, his tone laced with amusement. "Since you seem so interested in our discussion, why don't you come up here and solve this?" A ripple of laughter spread across the room, quiet at first, then growing as students exchanged glances, some already pulling out their phones, sensing entertainment. Emily hesitated, her fingers tightening slightly, her gaze flicking from the board to the faces watching her, waiting. The equation stretched wide and unforgiving, something even the top students had struggled with for weeks. Hale stepped aside with exaggerated politeness, offering her the marker like it was a stage prop. "Go ahead," he said, lowering his voice just enough to feel personal, almost kind, but not quite. "Show us what you've got." The room held its breath, the air thick with expectation, the hum of the overhead lights suddenly louder than before. Emily took a slow step forward, then another, her shoes barely making a sound against the polished floor. Somewhere in the room, someone whispered, "This is going to be painful." Hale folded his arms, satisfied, already certain of the outcome, already enjoying the moment before it unfolded. Because in his mind, this was simple, a harmless joke, a reminder of who belonged and who didn't. But as Emily reached the board and wrapped her fingers around the marker, something shifted, subtle, almost invisible, but enough that if anyone had been paying close attention, they would have noticed the change in her eyes. Steady, focused, unafraid. And in that quiet, suspended second, just before the first mark touched the board, the room didn't yet realize they were about to witness something that would change everything. The marker touched the board, and for a moment, nothing happened, just the faint squeak of the tip against the white surface as Emily Carter stood there, her shoulders relaxed, her breathing steady, as if the dozens of eyes behind her did not exist. A quiet chuckle broke the silence from somewhere in the middle row, followed by another, then a whisper that carried farther than intended. "She does not even know where to start." Professor Hale did not intervene, his arms still crossed, his posture confident, almost casual, as though he had already seen the ending to this story. But Emily did not rush. She studied the equation carefully, her gaze moving from one term to the next, not hesitating, not guessing, but recognizing. The numbers were not foreign to her. They never had been. 5 years earlier, long before the gray uniform and the quiet routine of late-night cleaning shifts, Emily Carter had lived in a world where equations like this were not impossible challenges, but daily conversations. Back then, she had filled notebooks instead of trash bins, solved problems instead of wiping boards clean. But life had shifted, responsibilities had changed, and brilliance had been packed away into silence. Until now, her hand moved. One line. Clean. Precise. A few students leaned forward slightly, the laughter fading as curiosity replaced it. Another line followed, then another, each step deliberate, each transition smooth, as though she was not solving the problem, but unfolding it. The room began to quiet in a different way now, not out of expectation of failure, but something else, something harder to name. Professor Hale's expression did not change at first, but his eyes narrowed just slightly, tracking her movements, noticing the structure of her approach. This was not random. This was not guessing. This was method. Emily adjusted her grip on the marker and continued, her pace steady, neither rushed nor hesitant, as if she had done this 1,000 times before. A student in the front row slowly lowered his phone, no longer smiling. Another whispered, softer this time, "Wait, that is actually correct." The words barely reached beyond his seat, but the shift had already begun. Emily paused for half a second, not because she was unsure, but because she was choosing the next step carefully, then continued, rewriting a portion of the equation in a form that made the structure clearer, more elegant, more efficient than what had been taught moments earlier. The air in the room tightened. Professor Hale uncrossed his arms. It was subtle, almost imperceptible, but it was the first crack in his certainty. He stepped slightly closer, his gaze sharpening, scanning each line she had written, searching for an error, a misstep, anything that would restore the balance he believed in. But the board offered him nothing. Only clarity, only precision, only something he had not expected to see. Emily finished another transformation, her movements fluid, confident, and the equation began to collapse into something simpler, something beautiful. The laughter was gone now, completely, replaced by a silence that felt heavier than before. And in that silence, for the first time, Professor Hale did not look like the man in control of the room. He looked like someone trying to understand how he had just lost it. Professor Hale stepped closer to the board now, no longer pretending this was entertainment, his polished shoes echoing softly against the floor as the distance between authority and uncertainty shrank with every line Emily wrote. His eyes scanned the equations rapidly, then again, slower this time, as if repetition might reveal a flaw that logic refused to offer. But there was none. Each transformation was not only correct, it was intentional, refined, almost elegant. Emily Carter did not look back at him, did not seek approval, did not acknowledge the shift happening behind her. Her focus remained fixed on the board, her hand moving with quiet confidence, rewriting the final structure of the problem into something that no longer resembled the tangled complexity it had been just minutes ago. In the seats behind her, students leaned forward, their earlier amusement replaced by something closer to disbelief. One student in the second row whispered, barely audible, "She is simplifying it. That is not even how he showed us." Another responded, "No, it is better." The words spread in fragments, soft, cautious, as though speaking too loudly might break whatever was unfolding in front of them. The room had changed, not suddenly, but completely. The same space that had once carried laughter now held a different weight, something sharper, something humbling. Emily paused again, this time only for a breath, her eyes tracing the final line before she completed it, and then she wrote the last step. The solution stood there, clear and undeniable. For a moment, nothing happened. No applause, no reaction, just silence. The kind of silence that does not come from emptiness, but from realization. Professor Hale stared at the board, his expression no longer composed, his mind moving quickly through every possible angle, every justification, every explanation that could restore his position. He reached for the marker, almost instinctively, as if to correct something, but his hand stopped halfway. There was nothing to correct. His voice, when it came, was quieter than before, stripped of its earlier confidence. "That is one approach," he said, though even as he spoke, the words felt hollow. Emily turned slightly then, not fully facing him, just enough to acknowledge his presence, her expression calm, almost gentle. "There is a small inconsistency in the original assumption," she said, her voice steady, clear, carrying easily through the silent room. She stepped forward and pointed to a section of the equation he had written earlier, a detail so subtle that most had overlooked it entirely. "If you adjust this condition," she continued, "the solution becomes more stable." The words landed differently than anything before, not as a challenge, not as defiance, but as truth. Professor Hale followed her gesture, his eyes locking onto the exact point she indicated, and for the first time, something shifted in his expression that could not be hidden. Recognition, the kind that arrives quietly but changes everything. Around them, the students did not move. They did not speak. They simply watched, as the authority they had trusted began to unravel, not through force, not through argument, but through clarity. And in that moment, standing in front of a room that no longer saw her as invisible, Emily Carter did something even more unexpected. She stepped back, placed the marker down gently on the ledge, and said nothing more. The marker rested quietly on the ledge, and for a moment, no one in the room knew what to do next. Emily Carter stepped back fully now, her hands lowering to her sides, her posture returning to the same quiet presence she had carried when she first walked in, as if nothing extraordinary had just taken place. But everything had changed. The equation remained on the board, untouched, undeniable, a silent witness to what had just unfolded. Professor Hale did not speak immediately. His gaze remained fixed on the section Emily had pointed out, his mind retracing every step, every assumption, every moment that had led him here. The confidence that once filled the room had shifted, not vanished, but redirected, and now it was no longer centered on him. A student in the front row finally broke the silence, not loudly, but enough that others heard. She is right. The words were simple, but they carried weight. Another voice followed, then another, each one cautious, respectful, no longer mocking. That correction, it changes everything. Phones that had been raised for entertainment were now lowered slowly, almost awkwardly, as if the intention behind them no longer fit the moment. Professor Hale inhaled, straightening slightly, attempting to reclaim the authority that had defined him for years. Mathematics allows for multiple perspectives, he said, his tone measured, controlled, but lacking the sharp certainty it once held. Yet even as he spoke, his eyes returned to the board, to the clarity he could not dismiss. Emily did not respond. She simply turned, walking back toward her cart with the same quiet steps she had taken before, her shoes soft against the polished floor, her expression unchanged. It was as if she had never stepped into the center of the room at all. But the students watched her now, truly watched her, not as background, not as a passing presence, but as someone they had completely misunderstood. One student stood slightly, hesitating, then sat back down, unsure of what to say, unsure if anything should be said. Because sometimes, acknowledgement does not come through words. It comes through silence. Professor Hale finally set the marker down with deliberate care, his movements slower than before, as though each action required more thought than it had just minutes earlier. He glanced toward Emily, then away, then back again, as if searching for the right response and finding none that felt sufficient. The authority he had relied on had not been challenged through confrontation, but through something far more difficult to resist. Truth, presented without arrogance. Precision, offered without demand. And in that quiet space, something unspoken settled over the room, a realization that lingered longer than any lecture ever could. Emily reached her cart, placing her hand lightly on its handle, ready to continue the work she had been doing before all of this began. She did not look back. She did not wait. But just before she moved, a voice from behind her, softer now, uncertain, broke through the silence. Miss Carter. The name sounded different this time. Not dismissive, not casual, but careful. And for the first time, the room was not waiting to laugh. It was waiting to understand. The voice lingered in the air, uncertain yet sincere, and for the first time, Emily Carter stopped before moving forward. Her hand remained on the cart, her posture still, as if weighing whether the moment required a response or silence. Slowly, she turned. Not dramatically, not with any intention to command attention, but just enough to face the room that had only minutes ago dismissed her. Every eye was on her now. Not one looked away. The student who had spoken swallowed slightly, then continued. How did you see that? His question was not mocking. It was searching, honest. And that honesty shifted the room once again. Emily's gaze moved across the rows, taking in the faces that had laughed, the ones that had recorded, the ones now leaning forward with quiet respect. She did not rush her answer. The structure tells you, she said simply, her voice calm, steady, carrying without effort. If you listen to it long enough. A faint murmur passed through the students, not confusion, but recognition of something deeper than memorization, something beyond formulas written in textbooks. Professor Hale stood near the board, still, silent, his usual authority replaced by something far less familiar. Reflection. He looked at Emily again, this time not as an interruption, not as a mistake, but as someone he had failed to understand. The realization settled slowly, but firmly. You studied mathematics, he said, not as a question, but as a conclusion forming in real time. Emily did not answer immediately. Her eyes held his for a brief second, then softened. "A long time ago," she replied. The simplicity of the statement carried more weight than any explanation could have. It was not a claim. It was not a defense. It was a truth that needed no embellishment. The room absorbed it quietly. A student in the back shook his head slightly, almost in disbelief. Another leaned forward, elbows on the desk, completely engaged now. The dynamic had shifted entirely. This was no longer a lecture. It was something else. Something real. Professor Hale glanced back at the board once more, then at the students, then finally back at Emily. His voice, when he spoke again, was different. Not weaker, but stripped of performance. "Would you be willing to explain your approach?" The question hung in the air, unexpected, almost impossible if anyone had imagined it an hour earlier. Emily looked at the board, then back at him, then at the students waiting, not for entertainment, but for understanding. For a moment, it seemed as if she might decline, as if she might simply return to her quiet routine and let the moment pass. But then she stepped forward again, not to prove anything, not to reclaim anything, but to share. She reached for the marker, her fingers steady, and faced the board once more. And as she began to speak, explaining each step with clarity and calm precision, the room listened in a way it never had before. Not because they were told to, but because they finally understood who they were listening to. And in that quiet transformation, something far greater than a single problem had been solved. Emily Carter's voice did not rise, yet every word carried through the lecture hall with a clarity that held attention more firmly than any authority ever had. She did not rush, did not perform, did not seek approval. Instead, she guided. "When you look at a problem like this," she said, writing a small adjustment beside the original equation, "you do not start by forcing a solution. You start by understanding what the equation is trying to become." The students leaned forward, pens forgotten, screens dimmed, their focus locked entirely on her. She moved step by step, not skipping, not simplifying for the sake of speed, but revealing the logic beneath each transformation. What had once seemed impossible now unfolded into something almost intuitive. A student near the front shook his head slowly, whispering, under his breath, "Why did no one teach it like this?" No one answered, because the question was not meant for the room. Professor Hale stood still, listening, his expression no longer guarded but reflective, as if each word Emily spoke was quietly rewriting something deeper than the equation on the board. She paused briefly, then continued, pointing to the earlier assumption again. "This is where everything begins," she said. "If the foundation is slightly off, every step that follows will feel harder than it needs to be." The simplicity of her explanation settled over the room, not as a correction, but as clarity, the kind that could not be argued with. A student raised his hand instinctively, then hesitated, unsure if the usual rules still applied. Emily noticed and gave a small nod. "Go ahead." His voice was careful, respectful. "How did you know to question that part?" She considered the question for a moment, then answered without hesitation. "Because it felt wrong." A faint ripple of surprise moved through the room, not at the answer itself, but at the confidence behind it. "Mathematics is not just calculation," she added. "It is pattern, structure, and intuition. When something breaks that pattern, you do not ignore it. You listen." The room absorbed her words in silence. Not the heavy silence from before, but a focused one, filled with understanding. Professor Hale stepped slightly closer, his voice quieter now, almost thoughtful. "And you developed that intuition, how?" Emily's gaze shifted briefly, not away, but inward, as if passing through memories that had long been set aside. "By spending years asking questions no one else asked," she said softly. There was no pride in her tone, no attempt to impress, only honesty. She turned back to the board and finished the final explanation, her hands steady, her movements precise. When she stepped back this time, there was no hesitation, no uncertainty, just completion. The equation was no longer a challenge. It was a lesson. The room remained still, every student aware that they had just witnessed something rare. Not just intelligence, but clarity delivered without ego. Professor Hale looked at the board one last time, then at Emily, and for the first time since the lecture began, he did not try to reclaim control. Because in that moment, Control was no longer the point. Understanding was. And Emily Carter had just changed. The way an entire room would see both. No one moved when she finished. The silence lingered, not empty but full, as if the room itself needed time to catch up with what had just happened. Emily Carter stepped away from the board once more, placing the marker down with the same quiet care as before, her role complete, her presence returning to something almost invisible again. But the room would not let her disappear this time. A student in the front row slowly began to clap, hesitant at first, as if unsure whether it was appropriate. Then another joined, and another, until the sound grew. Not loud, not overwhelming, but steady, genuine. It was not applause for performance. It was recognition. Emily paused, her hand resting lightly against the edge of her card, her expression unchanged, though something softer passed through her eyes for just a moment. Professor Hale did not join the applause immediately. He stood still, watching, his thoughts clearly somewhere deeper than the surface of the moment. The identity he had carried for years, the one built on certainty, authority, and control, had not been shattered, but it had been quietly challenged in a way he could not ignore. He stepped forward, his voice measured, stripped of the sharp edges it once held. "Class," he said, and the room gradually quieted again, though the atmosphere had shifted permanently. "What you have just seen is not something you find in textbooks." His gaze moved briefly to Emily, then back to the students. "It is understanding." The words settled differently now, carrying weight that had not been there before. A student raised her hand, this time without hesitation. "Why have we never been taught to think like that?" The question hung in the air, honest and direct. Professor Hale did not answer immediately. He looked at the board, then at his own notes, then back at the class. "Because," he said slowly, "it is easier to teach steps than it is to teach insight." The admission was quiet, but it changed everything. Emily listened, her posture still composed, her presence calm, as if the conversation unfolding around her was not about her at all. Another student spoke up, leaning forward. "Miss Carter, would you ever teach?" The question carried a different kind of curiosity now, not about what she had done, but about who she was. Emily hesitated for the first time, not out of uncertainty, but because the question reached beyond the moment. Her eyes moved across the room, meeting the gaze of students who no longer saw her as background, but as someone they wanted to learn from. "I think," she said carefully, "teaching is not about standing in front of a room." She paused, choosing her words with quiet precision. "It is about helping someone see what they could not see before." The room absorbed her answer in silence once more, but this time it was different. It was not the silence of shock. It was the silence of respect. Professor Hale nodded slightly, almost imperceptibly, as if acknowledging something he had just learned himself. And in that moment, the roles in the room had shifted in a way no one would forget. Not through confrontation, not through force, but through something far more powerful. Clarity, offered without pride. And as Emily Carter gently turned her card, ready to leave the front of the room behind, no one laughed, no one whispered, no one looked away. Because now, they understood exactly who had been standing in front of them all along. The wheels of Emily Carter's cart moved softly across the polished floor, the faint sound echoing through a room that no longer felt the same. Every step she took away from the board seemed to stretch the silence even further, as if no one wanted the moment to end. The lecture hall, once filled with quiet arrogance and predictable patterns, now held something unfamiliar, respect that had not been assigned by title, but earned through truth. A student near the aisle stood up, almost instinctively, then quickly sat back down, unsure of the right way to respond to something that did not fit into the usual rules of the classroom. Others followed her movement with their eyes, not wanting to miss even the smallest detail, as if the simple act of her walking away carried meaning. Professor Hale remained near the board, his gaze shifting between the equation and the woman who had rewritten more than just mathematics in that room. He cleared his throat slightly, the sound small but noticeable in the quiet. "Miss Carter," he said again, this time with intention, not hesitation. She stopped, just for a moment, her hand resting on the card handle, her posture still composed. "Yes," she replied, her voice calm, neither distant nor eager. Hale took a step forward, then another, as if closing the space between them required more than just movement. If, if you ever wish to return to this field, he said carefully, choosing each word with a precision that mirrored the lesson he had just witnessed, this university would be fortunate to have you. The statement hung in the air, unexpected, genuine, and for a brief second, the entire room seemed to lean into it. Emily did not respond immediately. Her eyes met his, steady, thoughtful, not surprised, but not unchanged either. She considered the offer not as an opportunity, but as a possibility that belonged to a different version of her life. I appreciate that, she said softly. But sometimes, where you are needed is not where you once belonged. The words settled into the room with quiet weight, not rejecting, not dismissing, but redefining what mattered. A student in the back whispered, "She is walking away from that." Another answered just as quietly, "Maybe she never needed it." Professor Hale nodded slowly, as if understanding something beyond the surface of her answer. For the first time, he did not try to persuade, did not try to correct, did not try to lead. He simply accepted. Emily gave a small, almost imperceptible nod in return, then turned once more, guiding her cart toward the exit. The door at the back of the lecture hall stood slightly open, a thin line of light stretching across the floor, and as she approached it, the contrast between the quiet inside and the world beyond felt almost symbolic. Just before she reached it, one student spoke again, louder this time, not out of interruption, but out of respect. "Thank you." The words were simple, but they carried everything the room could not fully express. Emily paused, her hand resting lightly on the door, then glanced back just enough for her voice to reach them all. "Keep asking questions," she said. "That is where it starts." Then she stepped through the doorway, and as the door closed softly behind her, the room remained still, not because it had nothing left to say, but because it finally understood that some moments are not meant to be filled with noise. They are meant to be remembered. The door closed with a soft click, and for a long moment, no one in the lecture hall moved. It was not hesitation. It was reflection, the kind that settles slowly, reshaping thoughts that once felt certain. The equation still stretched across the board, untouched, its clarity now impossible to ignore, a silent reminder of everything that had just unfolded. Professor Hale stood where she had left him, his gaze fixed not on the symbols themselves, but on what they now represented. Not complexity, not challenge, but a perspective he had overlooked. He walked toward the board again, slower this time, each step measured, as if the distance held meaning. His hand reached out, not to erase, but to trace one of the lines Emily had written, following it carefully, almost respectfully. The room watched in silence. A student near the front spoke quietly, more to himself than anyone else. "She saw something we did not." Another replied just as softly, "No, she saw what we were not taught to see." The distinction lingered. Professor Hale turned to face the class, his expression no longer defined by authority, but by awareness. "What you experience today," he said, his voice steady but different, "is not about being right or wrong." He paused, allowing the weight of his words to settle. "It is about understanding that knowledge is not owned. It is discovered, and sometimes it comes from places you least expect." The students listened, not out of obligation, but because the truth in his words now carried meaning. The structure of the class had shifted, not in form, but in purpose. A young woman in the second row raised her hand. "Will we learn to think like that?" The question held hope, not doubt. Professor Hale looked at the board once more, then back at her. "That depends," he said, "on whether you are willing to question more than just the problem in front of you." The room absorbed the answer in thoughtful silence. Outside, faint sounds of footsteps passed in the hallway, ordinary life continuing as if nothing extraordinary had happened. But inside, something had changed permanently. A perspective had been opened, a certainty had been challenged, and a quiet woman, who had walked in unseen, had left behind something far greater than recognition. She had left understanding. Professor Hale picked up the marker again, not with the intention of continuing where he had left off, but with the intention of beginning differently. He turned back to the board and added a single line beneath Emily's solution, not altering it, not correcting it, but acknowledging it. The students watched closely, aware that even this small action carried significance. Then he stepped back, placing the marker down once more, and looked at the room. "Class dismissed," he said softly. But no one rushed to leave. Not immediately. They remained seated for a moment longer, as if holding on to something they did not want to lose. Eventually, chairs shifted, bags were gathered, and quiet conversations began, not about grades or assignments, but about what they had just witnessed. And somewhere beyond the door, out of sight, Emily Carter continued down the hallway, her steps steady, her presence quiet once more. But the echo of what she had done remained behind, woven into the minds of everyone in that room. And that day, without seeking attention, without claiming recognition, she reminded them of something they would not forget. That true understanding does not announce itself loudly. It reveals itself when the world is finally ready to listen.